All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 2, Section 3, Challenges to Spain's Supremacy. So let us recall that when it came to the Americas, Spain was really the first European nation to take advantage of the resources there. It was the Spanish who conquered the Aztecs. It was the Spanish who conquered the Inca. They extracted a huge amount of wealth, and it didn't take very long for other nations, specifically Spain's rivals, to challenge what was now really a global superpower in Spain. But before we get to the national challenges, let us just recall from last section that in 2.2, there was a fundamental religious challenge to Spain. Now, they're not completely divorced from the challenges of other nations, but it's also worth noting, and that is the Protestant Reformation. And that was Spain really being the preeminent Catholic power was responsible for picking up a lot of the pieces that broke away from the Catholic Church and spent a huge amount of resources in doing that. In terms of this section, we're going to be looking mostly at nations. These are other countries that are challenging Spain, mainly England, France, and the Netherlands. Now, like Spain, they have some similar motives. For pretty much all of these nations, wealth is a motive, that is to make money. Every single one of these nations, Spain included, go to the New World to make wealth. Now, what they end up finding wealth from or making money on differs, but they all have that same goal. And then again, religion plays an important role. Recall that when it comes to religion, England and the Netherlands, so we might say Protestant, mostly, England is a Protestant nation, so they're on that side. The Netherlands are a Protestant nation. When it comes to Catholic nations, Spain definitely, and France, although there are some Protestant people in France, the rulers of France, the movers, the shakers, so forth, they tend to be Catholic as well. So religious motivations also spill over into the New World. So first, let's take a look at England, and England is probably the most detailed here. One, because there's a lot of variation in the English colonies, but two, because it's eventually the English colonies that go on to create or make up the United States. So we kind of put them under a little bit bigger of a magnifying glass. Some of the very first English efforts at the New World or involvement in the New World was quite literally related to Spain, and that was to hire privateers. A privateer is like we'll call it a state-funded pirate. And the purpose was to literally steal from Spanish ships, especially silver. Sir Francis Drake was probably one of the most well-known English privateers. So Francis Drake, we'll call him a well-known English privateer. And we got to remember that this is occurring at a time when England and Spain are at war with each other. 1588, that was when the Spanish Armada attacked England. So any effort by English privateers or state-funded pirates to steal from Spain would benefit England and would diminish Spain's position. Back at home, England had gone through a lot of religious strife. Remember or recall the movement from Henry VIII, who broke away from the Catholic Church, made England Protestant, the reversion back to Catholicism with Bloody Mary, and then finally back to Protestantism with Elizabeth I. So there was a lot going on at home in England to where they couldn't really focus on the New World as much as maybe they would have liked. Additionally, they were fighting Spain. They were also colonizing Ireland before that. So it really took the English a little while before they put forward a serious effort to establish a foothold in the New World that simply just wasn't stealing from Spain. Roanoke in 1590, this was the first attempt for England to colonize the New World. And the thing that you need to know about Roanoke mainly is that it failed. It was located in modern-day North Carolina. Sir Walter Raleigh was the individual responsible for establishing the Roanoke colony. The colonists there were not prepared really to survive on their own. The only way the Roanoke colony survived was by ships of supplies coming back from England. And when the Spanish Armada interrupted those supplies, the colony itself vanished. So we might say the people, or we'll say the English at Roanoke vanished. And so when the supply ship, delayed by a few years, finally got to Roanoke, everyone who was there was gone. And the only remnants of that colony was this word Croatoan. This was a word carved into a tree trunk. And to this very day, trunk, T-R-U-N-K, to this very day, we still don't know what happened to the colonists at Roanoke. Sometimes it's referred to as the lost colony. It remains a mystery, but the bottom line here about at least early attempts by England to colonize the New World is that it ended up in failure. Now, there were other motives behind. Roanoke, for example, was created in part to be a base for privateers to continue to plunder the Spanish. But it didn't take long for other English to look to the New World to gain more wealth and more profit. And a development that was going on in the Old World at the time, especially in places like England and the Netherlands, was the creation of joint stock companies. A joint stock company it's sort of like a business structure, right? So we'll call it joint stock company. We'll call this a business structure that pools, we'll just say money, by selling stock. So if we just kind of take a moment here and think about the way that Christopher Columbus funded his voyage. Now recall that Columbus had 3 ships, right? The Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria. He also had 90 men, 90 people that were part of his crew, and needed to have all the supplies and food and rations and everything else that was necessary to survive a couple of months. Now, Columbus himself didn't have that type of resources or those types of resources, so he had to look for people to sponsor his voyage. And of course, Columbus looked to the only people in Spain who had that much money, and that was, of course, the king and queen of Spain who could fund that voyage. Now, that's very difficult to find enough money, right? Enough money, resources that could buy all these things. Not very many people have that to give. What a joint stock company does is that it alleviates that problem in a lot of ways. So rather than having to find one single person, like a king or a queen, to sponsor your voyage that has a lot of money, instead, what a joint stock company does is that it pools resources from multiple people, multiple investors, who then just give a little bit of money. And if you can get enough people to give a little bit of money, then you have enough money to fund whatever voyage to the New World that you want. In exchange, the company, right, whatever consists of the company, whether it's ships or men, will give back to their investors something called a stock, which is a little piece of paper that says you own a certain percentage of this company. The idea is that the company goes to the New World, it trades, it makes a profit, and it brings back value to their investors. And what this does and why it's so significant is that it lowers the risk and could potentially raise more money, right? It makes trading easier. And these joint stock companies were really starting to take hold in places like England and the Netherlands. They eventually took hold in places like Spain and France, but it made doing business in the New World a lot easier. Essentially, joint stock companies are the predecessors to what are modern day corporations. So equipped with this new business structure, right, investors looked to companies to make money in the New World. And one such company, the Virginia Company, was responsible, an English company, responsible for creating Jamestown, which is significant, the Jamestown colony, which is significant because it eventually became the first permanent colony in the New World. So of Jamestown, this is worth noting, it was the first permanent English colony in the New World. And remember, it was established by a company, a joint stock company, the Virginia Company. So we know that the goal or the motive was to make money. That's the idea. The colony itself was created along the Chesapeake Bay, modern day Virginia, as you might imagine, was where Jamestown was. They had hoped, the colonists there had hoped that they would come across instant wealth in the same way that the Spanish did. However, there was no instant wealth to be found. So even though there was the goal of striking it rich right away, it didn't happen. So we might say just of instant wealth, we'll just go ahead and put a big cross over that. It didn't happen. We'll talk more about Jamestown and what happened to the colony there and how they eventually made money. On top of that, the English also established a presence in the West Indies. Recall that the West Indies is also what we refer to as the Caribbean. Now, the Spanish were some of the first ones in the Caribbean, but eventually other European powers made their way there and made a presence. The English, amongst other islands, colonized Barbados and organized Barbados as a sugar plantation that used African slaves, right? So this might be worth mentioning, African slaves. And this blueprint of growing sugar using slave labor from Africa really comes to characterize all of the Caribbean colonies, whether it's English, whether it's French. Eventually the French gain a few Caribbean colonies, the Dutch gain a few Caribbean colonies, the Spanish have some there, right? That this is an equation that can yield a lot of profits. Now, as we'll learn, you can't grow sugar everywhere. The climate has to be sort of right in that tropical area. But it's this equation that eventually makes its way to the English southern colonies. We'll talk about the way that eventually African slavery gets imported into the English colonies of North America. It's important to understand that African slavery didn't arrive to the English colonies straight from Africa. It arrived to the Caribbean first via sugar plantations and then arrived to the North American colonies. So in both the colonies of Barbados, and we'll maybe use green here, in Barbados, around the Chesapeake Bay, in Virginia, in Jamestown, those English people that went there were looking for the almighty dollar. Now, this differs pretty dramatically from the English colonies that settle a little bit further north in North America. We'll talk about two of the earliest groups that settle what we call New England, or the northern part of North America. The first ones are the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims are a religious group. They created the Plymouth colony. So Plymouth is a Pilgrim colony. And the Pilgrims are a little bit like the Puritans, but there's a slight difference in their belief systems. Recall that the Puritans got their name, and we talked about this in, what was it, last section, 2.2, whatever section it was, that they want to purify the Church of England of Catholic elements. In other words, in their view, in the Puritan view, the Church of England was still too Catholic and needed to go further to get rid of these Catholic elements. So in some ways, the Puritans think that the Church of England can be saved, right? That the Church of England can change enough that it'll be adequate. The Pilgrims are in the same boat, except they don't think that the Church of England can be saved, and they want to completely break away from the Church of England. So the Pilgrims will say, don't want purification. They want, not even knowing this, separation. It even rhymes. Separation. That the Church of England is still too Catholic. It can't be saved. Let's just break away and create our own colony. And so they established the Plymouth colony. It's around modern day Massachusetts, sort of. The ship they sailed on was called the Mayflower. So this is the ship Pilgrims sailed on. And on that ship, they signed the Mayflower Compact, which was a written governing, one of the first written governing documents in the New World. And one of the reasons why it's important is because the Mayflower Compact is sort of loosely democratic. And so, especially having the perspective of where we are today, and especially considering the way that the United States took shape as a democratic government, oftentimes we kind of look back at the Mayflower Compact and say, you know what, this was a significant document because it sort of loosely organized the Pilgrim community on democratic principles. The reality is that at the time, even though the Pilgrims were a religious group and had this, document that I would say aged very well, they were generally a very small group and didn't really have a lot of influence. Instead, the much larger group and much more influential group was the Puritans, and they created a colony called the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So we want to remember this is the Puritan colony. All right, slight difference with the Pilgrims, don't exactly see eye to eye. And these were some of the two earliest colonies that were established for religious reasons. And so we can see a stark contrast between colonies like the Pilgrim colony of Plymouth and the Puritan colony of Massachusetts as compared with Jamestown, as compared with the West Indies, as compared with Barbados. These ones are all about making money. These religious communities are just about really sort of, living there and trying to create something separate from England. So two very separate motives, but still both English, right? Still both English. Other nations that also challenged Spanish power included France and the Netherlands. We'll just say a little bit about them. It's important to note that there was a French and Dutch presence in the New World, even though we'll be talking a lot more about the English colonies in particular. Again, it's because those colonies eventually are the ones that go on to create the United States. France, like Spain, was a predominantly Catholic nation, although there were some French Protestants. Their colony was New France, appropriately named. So New France is the French, say French Empire. Not really wasn't an empire. French colonies in the New World. Much of the early French exploration and colonization occurred along the St. Lawrence River. So if we're trying to figure out where France is geographically, this is mostly Eastern Canada today. That's kind of what we're thinking of. The explorer, which is typically credited with creating the French colony in North America, Samuel de Champlain, sometimes referred to as the father of New France. He founded Quebec, which became the capital city for France in the New World. So we might say French capital city in New World. Champlain will just say French, let's say colonizer, sometimes called the father of New France. Give you kind of an idea of how he's viewed in France, the father of New, F-R-A-N-C-E, right? Father of New France. And one thing that made France really unique and distinct from their European counterparts, the English, the Spanish, and the Dutch, was their unusually good relations with the Native Americans. we can certainly say that France had the best and strongest alliances with Native Americans. Part of that was intentional. Champlain, for example, wanted to create somewhat of a utopian society there, really kind of wanted everybody to get along, wanted the New World and New France to be a refuge from all the religious conflict and warfare that was going on in Europe at the time. But some of it was also just down to the practicality of it. Eastern Canada was relatively cold. Not a lot of French people wanted to live there permanently. Instead, what most French people did there was to engage in the fur trade. That was essentially to trade with the Indians who would capture the fur. And of course, if you're trying to set up a trading relation, you want to have good relations. You don't want to damage that relation. So the French had an economic interest in fact, getting along with Native Americans. A lot of the French were also there to spread the Catholic faith. And again, for the French who don't quite have the same military presence as Spain, they don't have that history of conquest. A lot of the Catholic missionaries, unlike their Spanish counterparts, were a lot more lenient when it came to converting the Native American population. So because there was no really strong hunger, you might say, for land, because the Indians were seen as trading partners and not people to be conquered, the French had good relations. However, that doesn't mean that things were always perfect. So, for example, one thing that did not discriminate was smallpox, and the fact that the French unknowingly spread diseases to native populations could make tension between those two sides, but also the way that New World and especially Eastern Woodlands Indians politics was set up is that the French unknowingly, in some instances, made enemies with certain tribes. So a perfect example is to kind of demonstrate the way that the French interacted with the Huron, the Algonquian, and the Iroquois. So the French made alliances with the Huron and the Algonquian Indians. So we might say French allies. However, the Hurons and the Algonquians were enemies of the Iroquois, right? These were rival tribes with each other. And so by allying themselves with the Huron and Algonquian, the Iroquois became French enemies. Right, French enemies. And in fact, that's what this image is depicting right here. It's showing how the French became involved in conflict, even if a guy like Champlain wanted to, quote unquote, give the olive branch wherever he went. Lastly, we'll talk about the Dutch. Now, recall that the Dutch had been fighting a war of independence against Spain. So we might say about Dutch, this is also the country of the Netherlands. Fought independence against Spain. So they're certainly an enemy to Spain. They're primarily Protestant in their religion. And for the Dutch, one really kind of good way to think about Dutch colonization is that they're really just in it for the money, right? For the Dutch, it is all about the money. They don't really have a strong religious motivation. They were ground zero in a lot of ways for the religious warfare of, that followed the Protestant Reformation. And so they're, kind of experienced firsthand how religious zeal can certainly have its ugly sides. So they're not really all that interested in spreading the faith, so to speak, but they'll make money when they can. And by the 1600s and all during the 1600s, the Dutch were really the commercial leaders of the world. Joint stock companies such as the Dutch East India Company and the Dutch West India Company. East India Company was a Dutch company that traded in Asia. It is the most valuable and wealthy corporation or business to have ever existed, the Dutch East India Company. The West Company traded in the Americas. The Dutch hired Henry Hudson. We'll call him a Dutch explorer. In terms of geography, the Dutch established colonies in modern-day New York. Henry Hudson and others were interested in finding a Northwest Passage. In fact, this was a motivation for pretty much all of the nations, was to find a Northwest Passage. And that was to go back to what Columbus originally wanted and that was a water route to Asia. Now, a Northwest Passage exists. You can sail above Canada or below South America, but there was a hope that one of these rivers in the Americas would lead out to the Pacific Ocean. In those days, sailing above Canada was really a no-go because of the way that ships were built, primarily out of wood, and the fact that those waters could be frozen. It was practically impossible to do that. But French, Dutch, English, Spanish explorers continue to sail down these rivers, hoping that there's a direct water route to Asia. Never really found anything. The Dutch did establish a presence there by competing with the French in the fur trade. So there is a small Dutch presence in what is New York. Of course, as with all of these colonies, the Dutch named their colonial possessions New Netherland. That is their New World. We'll say New World colony. And the capital, again, creatively named, is simply just New Amsterdam. So we'll call this the capital city.